Also, this is just another question. I guess it's not, I don't know if you would want to answer this or if you have time, but you brought up slavery and how like Islam kind of phased it out. But like, I'm just wondering if there is any room, like, if someone wanted to bring back slavery right now, is Islam okay with, like, is that okay? Islam?
So I think it was Bin Baz who was asked this question. Was it Bin Baz or Uthaymeen? One of the scholars was asked about, there was a conflict and he was being asked about this and he said, no, that's finished. And someone, I'd need someone who has more knowledge on this to verify this, but I remember there was an opinion about a recent conflict in which slaves could have been taken and the scholar said no. Now let me just explain something very important. There is zero slavery in Islam, okay? Slavery is zero rights. What happened in America when they were the transatlantic slave trade and in Europe, they took these people, they killed them, they butchered them, they raped them, they slaved them, they mutilated them, they gave them no rights. A slave by definition has no rights. Islam doesn't have slavery. Islam has something which is different, which is best to describe as bonded servants. Bonded servants. So I'll explain something. In the Quran it says, if a slave wants their freedom and they want to work towards their freedom, give it to them. That's in the Quran. And in the Quran and the Prophet told us, treat people justly. The Prophet told us that the slaves should be eating the food that we're eating and they're wearing the clothes that we're wearing. That's not slavery. And also, there was a man that hit a slave. He hit a slave. He felt bad, he went to the Prophet. And the repercussion for hitting the slave was the slave was freed. This is not slavery. Islam has something different to it. And Islam encourages freeing of slaves and the right treatment of these people. So whenever we look at slaves, we think of what happened in the transatlantic slave trade. You cannot compare that to what happened. You know the Prophet's uncle Abbas, right? The Prophet's uncle Abbas. At one point he was a slave and he was freed. So we have to understand slavery in Islam is a term which is used quite loosely. There's slavery in Islam. But I challenge anyone to show there's ever been one slave in Islam. Because a slave by definition has no rights. In the Quran and the Prophet say that slaves have rights. In fact, there's something really interesting. The Prophet forbade Muslims from saying my slave man or my slave girl, because the Prophet said you all slaves of God. So there's actually authentic narration of the Prophet where he said, do not say my slave girl or my slave boy, right? What's the name of that guy in America who wrote a book on Islam and slavery? That
Islam and slavery.
The revert guy, Jonathan something. Jonathan Brown. What's his book called? Basically, Google this book called Jonathan Brown. This book is written about slavery. I haven't read it. I heard it's very good. Just letting you know. But these nuances are really important because no one had this 1400 years ago.
Just another question about that. What is the wisdom, or like what are the parameters around men having intercourse with their female slaves in Islam?
I
believe that's covered in the book. I believe that's covered in the book.
Again, a lot of these things were you have to put in a lot of your questions. It really helped trying to understand the context in which Islam came, how the pre-Islamic Arabia was, and the world was really. It put a lot of context. Even with that, Islam put rules down. So hang on a minute, you have to marry the slave, or there are rights to get her pregnant, etc., etc. There are certain things in there. Well, I suppose your wider question would be, why not just outright forbid everything, right? Just make everything haram.
But even I don't think that men had to marry. They could just freely have intercourse.
No, there were rights. There were rights that were given. Before that, there were no rights. You could do what you want. You could treat them like absolute property, like cattle. But there were rights given. No, you can't do that. But then there are certain things that are, again, in that context, in that society, in that time, it was very different. But what Islam did was, it didn't just, the whole of slavery, they didn't just abolish it straight away. So, no, it's all haram. That's it. Because it said society would collapse. It would have collapsed on itself. Again, Islamic
collapsed if they weren't allowed to have sex with their female.
Let me explain to you how. Okay, let me explain to you how ancient warfare worked. Ancient warfare was all about reproduction. Is battlefield success. So what would happen is two tribes would fight each other. The women from these tribes, all their husbands would be dead. So you wouldn't just leave them, they would be taken by the other tribes and assimilated into that tribe. This was ancient times. Persia, Rome, China, India, everyone was doing the same thing. So what Islam said, it came and regulated that. It regulated that, it didn't ban it, it regulated it. Now someone can turn around today and say, I think the best thing would have been that Muslims just refused to engage in slavery at all and let the other empires engage in them, and they had greater reproductive success. From a purely sociological perspective, Islam would be at a massive disadvantage on the battlefield. So these things, look, sometimes it's very hard to understand objectively, but in warfare, a lot of the early times, there was no states, there was no borders. Everything in the beginning was the age of empires. It was to do with warfare, and reproduction was one of the fastest ways to replenish your troops, which is why people that could reproduce faster, they actually won greater land, they won greater territory, they had greater empires. It was a different universe. That's why a lot of those things today, when we try and understand them, we cannot understand them because the context has disappeared.
Well, so then that's my question. Like, if someone wanted to bring it back, like technically, like what in Islam is there that would like prohibit that? You know?
Okay, so in Islam, the Prophet taught us the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. So for example, I'm not a scholar. If I say something, I have to find it in the Quran, in the sayings of the Prophet, or the consensus of the first three generations of Muslims. That's it. That is Islam. So what we find is that if there's a contemporary problem today, say the war in Bosnia, during this conflict, female slaves could have been taken. But there was an Islamic scholar who was asked, and I think his name was Bin Baz or Uthaymeen, I don't remember which one of those scholars it was. He was asked, are we allowed to take female slaves? And the scholar said no, because that's finished. That was in the past. So to answer your question, can we bring slavery back? Well, according to scholars who are inheritors of the prophets, the answer is no.
Yeah, you have like councils of scholars, fiqh councils and all sorts. What they in Islam, because it's a living religion, each time society adapts to it. So the scholars who will have inherited, that's why they're the inheritors of prophets, because they who you turn to for guidance, and who will have the understanding, the full context.
And there'll never be a consensus of Muslim scholars upon falsehood.
Yeah.
You can always have one guy randomly saying X, Y, Z, but a consensus of the scholars will never be upon falsehood. Yeah.
Thank you. What were your guys' names?
Subboor.
Subboor Hassan.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you guys from the States?
Yeah, we are.
I just want to, which city are you from?
I'm from Minneapolis.
I find, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way at all, I've spent a lot of time at Speaker's Corner and I speak to people regularly. British Muslims don't really have these questions as much as American Muslims do. And I just wanted to ask you a question about this. Generally, when I find American Muslims, they are a lot more liberal than the Muslims here. Do you have the same experience?
I mean, I've only been in London for like 2-ish days and I haven't interacted with a lot of Muslims here, but like, so I actually can't answer your question.
No, I'm just asking about America, United States.
Compared to Muslims in London, like I don't know, I don't interact with that many Muslims in London, but I don't know.
I think they're in the United States, you guys are, the Muslim community especially, they're in the American society, they're very cleverly linked minorities all onto the democratic side, the left leaning, the liberal side, because they said, oh, these Republicans and the right, and they all like, oh, it's not us. And therefore, I think maybe because of that, it's got a cultural influence on the Muslims.
I also think it's because when you look, for example, here in London, we have Chinatown with Chinese people. We have Golders Green with Jewish people. We have East London with lots of Muslims. I think in America, the Muslims are scattered all over the place. And that weakens the Muslim identity, it weakens the Muslim confidence, it weakens the ability of Muslims to articulate themselves. Because this pattern, I've seen it for so many years that I don't believe it's something that has no basis. So I was trying to figure out what is the actual cause. My understanding is because the Muslims in America because America's so big, they don't seem to have a strong community in one area. They all seem to be thinned out in different places.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I feel like geographically, like Europe is just closer to the homeland, I guess.
The homelands of Islam,
Yeah,
yeah.
so-
Like Morocco is down the corner, yeah.
Around the corner, right?
Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Bosnia. Bosnia's in Europe. That could possibly be the case. Yeah.
I'd recommend, you guys are from the United States. There's 3 scholars in the United States I particularly recommend, especially for you, listening to your questions. So I find the explanations very good. One is Dr. Yasir Qadi. You know Yasir Qadi, right? Have a look at his explanations. He's got a lot of videos online as well. Anything you type in.
Hello, my friend.
In terms of
How you doing?
answers.
You're one of the very few Christians that wears a
Good
cross.
explanation. Dr. Yasir Qadi.
Are you strong in your faith?
Muslimah, European
I
Institute.
like to put it out there.
Huh?
Just learning, just like to put it out there.
I'm Muslim. I respect, having cordial religious dialogues and these things because we live in the same world,
100%. That's what I mean.
What are you, Roman Catholic or
Yeah, I'm just
English? Okay.
I don't want them DNA.
Huh?
I don't want them DNA things. It says sex, so I'll take that as a win.
Were you always religious?
No,